We will now begin the second part of the Texas Legislature portion of Unit 3. Now we're first going to talk about the leadership positions in the Texas Legislature. Uh, One of the most important, at least the most important in the House of Representatives, is the Speaker of the House, or the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It's a similar position to the Speaker of the House on a national level in the U.S. Congress. The Speaker of the House is elected by House members for a 2-year term. Because all members of the House of Representatives serve 2-year terms, the Speaker shall also be elected for a 2-year term. Uh, Considered by some to be the most powerful position in state government, basically because the Speaker of the House has great influence over legislation, over the laws that are either passed or even submitted to the full House for consideration. So the Speaker of the House has great influence over whether legislation passes or fails. Can The Speaker of the House can use uh, legislative techniques to kill a bill or to expedite it, make it pass more quickly and efficiently, all depending on the Speaker's own ideological preferences or for whatever reason. Also, the Speaker of the House appoints the chairs of all committees and most members of each standing committee. So that's a huge power because it's the committees themselves, and this is another reason why the Speaker has great influence. It's the committees that actually write the laws, and they vote on whether the proposed bills will even reach the floor of the House for a vote. The Speaker also appoints members of the calendar, procedural, conference, and special committees, and is the presiding officer over all sessions. Also refers all bills to committees. So basically, every single bill that goes through the legislature passes through the hands of the Speaker of the House in some way, and that gives the Speaker great influence and power. The Lieutenant Governor is the other leadership position. He or she is the leader of the state Senate, elected statewide to a 4-year term. That means, unlike the Speaker of the House, who's elected by the House members, the Lieutenant Governor is elected separately in a popular vote by the people in a general election and serves a 4-year term. Now, the Lieutenant Governor is a weird position. The Lieutenant Governor is not formally part of the Senate and only votes to break a tie. This is a very similar position to the Vice President of the United States on the national level, where by Constitution, the Vice President presides over the Senate, yet does not participate in senatorial business for the most part. A Lieutenant Governor is similar in that way. But the Lieutenant Governor has great power, much like the House of Representatives, because he appoints the chairs and members of the Senate committees as well as the conference committees. So that is once again a very powerful um, tool to have if you want to be able to control or have or maintain control over legislation. He's the presiding officer and interprets the rules. There really is no rules committee. The Lieutenant Governor determines whether a rule has been broken or not, and the Lieutenant Governor refers all bills to the committees. So the two leaders of the separate bodies of the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate, both wield great power, especially in their appointive power over the committees. Now let's take a look at the different types of committees. One, standing committee. These are the most important committees because they are permanent, and it is where most of the legislative work is done. Every member of the House and the Senate are a member of at least one, but usually multiple standing committees. And generally, the people that are on the standing committees are familiar or have some type of familiarity with the role of the committee. Now, these committees are much like the national legislature committees, where they specialize in certain areas. You may have a committee on agriculture, or a committee on, urban affairs, a committee on education, and so people who sit on these committees, hopefully, are familiar with these areas. But they're permanent, and it is where a lot of legislation is written, marked up, which means changed, and it is where the decision is made. The standing committees, the decision is made as to whether a proposed bill, will be put up before the full House for a vote. And as I mentioned, it's where most of the legislative work is done. And the chairpersons of these standing committees, which are appointed by the House, the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, depending on the which body you're in, the chairpersons have great influence on which bills pass. They have great influence over whether bills make it to a calendar or not, which of course you must make it to a calendar to be considered by the full House or the full Senate. Now, another type of committee in the Texas legislature are conference committees, and once again, this is very similar to the U.S. legislature and their conference committees, where basically uh, the conference committees are convened when the House and the Senate, the Texas House and the Texas Senate, pass different versions of the same bill. And this occurs when, let's say, a bill gets its start or begins the process in the House of Representatives. Well, the House of Representatives is going to, in the committee, is going to mark it up and change it and add amendments and do this and that to it. And then at the end of the day, if it gets to the floor and they pass it, well, that bill that they passed is going to go to the Senate. But the problem is the Senate is probably going to go through the same process of marking it up, of changing it, maybe adding an amendment. And when they end up passing that same bill, it's a different version of the bill the House passed because they have made their changes. Well, you can't send a bill like that, two different versions of the same bill, to the governor's desk to be signed into law. So you have to work out the differences. And that's what a conference committee does. It's members of the House and the Senate who come together to work out the differences between the laws, and then they send it back to the respective houses, and it is there that they vote again. And if both sides passes, then it goes to the governor. And then there are interim committees that study issues between legislative sessions. Now, most of these are done from the home districts because the legislature is not in session. So, and of course, as we know, the legislature only meets every other year. So oftentimes, there's a whole year that goes by where I guess theoretically nothing can get done, but these interim committees kind of help expedite the process and maybe get things done to prepare for the legislative session. Now let's talk a little bit about how a bill becomes law. We're not going to go too in depth, but I would encourage you to look in your textbook. And in most textbooks, they usually have some type of flow chart or some type of listing of the process, or a step by step of the process of a legislative action where a bill enters as a proposed bill and comes out the other end as a law. So I encourage you to carefully look at that. But what we're going to talk about here is just a few generalities about how a bill becomes law, and one of the most important things we have to remember is that most bills that are introduced fail to pass. Most of them die in committee. Okay, most bills don't even get to the point that the entire House or the entire Senate gets to vote on them. Very few bills make substantial changes to law. They're usually incremental changes, small changes to existing law to help make the law better or to appeal to an interest group or some other group, and so they don't make big changes. That goes back to Texas and their political culture of traditionalism, where things don't change very much. And at each step in the process, when you look at it in the textbook, at each step in the process, a bill may die by either action or inaction, meaning that the bill, but by doing nothing, the legislature can allow a bill to die, or by doing something, they can kill a bill as well. A couple of terms I want you to know about additions or amendments to a bill in the state legislature, and those would be a rider. A rider is a provision attached to a bill that may not be of the same subject matter as the main bill. So let's say one legislator in the wants something special in a bill that for a constituent or for an interest group, or maybe just for personal reasons they want to add something to the bill. And if it's an education bill, it may have something to do with agriculture or vice versa, because it doesn't have to be the same subject matter as the bill. It can have nothing to do with the bill. Now, a closed rider are riders that are not made public until the conference committee meets. Now, these are very controversial, and and basically it's a kind of a sly way for the legislators to hide what they're doing from the general public, and it is not. I personally believe it's not very ethical to have a closed rider. All legislative processes, because we are a democracy and we have to hold our legislators accountable, that we should know everything that they're doing at all times. It should be all public. So these closed riders, which are hidden from the public, I don't feel I feel they harm democracy in some way. Now let's take a look at the bills calendar. There are two types of bills calendars. These are the scheduled addressing of the different bills. There's a major calendar and a minor calendar. They're treated differently. Obviously, it has something to do with the terminology itself. Major bills probably take priority. Minor bills do not. Minor bills can consist of local and consent calendars. Local and consent calendars. A local calendar is just that. This bill, that is being addressed by the state legislature, if it only affects one county, okay, just one county, it doesn't cross over and have any impact on another county, then it would be on the local calendar. Obviously, local, that's a good way to remember. Local is one small geographic area, and that would be a county. Now, to be put on the consent calendar, it must be minor and non-controversial. Of course, that's debatable what could be controversial or not controversial, but it can have crossover multiple counties, but it must not be a major bill, something that has a profound impact or is controversial. Now, the local and consent bills must receive unanimous support in House committee, and local and consent calendar committees must approve them. So they have to be, and the very fact that they're non-controversial probably makes it easy for them to receive unanimous support in the House committee. Now, the major bills calendar, there are different types of calendar on the major bills. There's really not a whole lot of difference, and there really isn't much of a priority on major bills until it comes to the end of the session, and maybe they're at crunch time, and then of course then the priorities kick in, where such as the emergency calendar would go first if they're coming down to the end of the legislative session and they're not sure they're going to make all the bills or they're going to be able to address all of the bills. Well, the emergency calendar would go first. But you also have the major state calendar and the general state calendar. So those are the three major bill calendars. And then, of course, the minor bills are the local calendar and the consent calendar. Now, anytime you talk about a legislature, you have to talk about why or how members of the legislature make their decisions, how they think about their job. And what we're going to do is take a look at the different theories of representation, or the different theories as to how a legislator or a person who makes laws, votes on laws, should think about how they do their job. And also, as voters, what we expect of our legislators. And there's three different types I want to talk about, three different theories. One is the delegate theory. If a legislator is a delegate, then the representative or the legislator votes based solely on the wishes of his or her constituents. So the constituents delegate the power of voting to the representative who votes however the constituents want. And this seems pretty simple and it seems logical in a democracy, but it may not always be the best way because being a delegate, you're a member of the legislature, you have more information about the bill and more information, probably more access to information about the bill and the impact of the bill than your people back home do. And if you only vote the way the people back home, your constituents, want you to vote, it may go against your own personal values or beliefs, whether that's a good bill or not. So delegates can struggle sometimes with this idea of do I vote or should I vote the way my constituents want me to, even though I disagree with it. Well, if you are a true delegate, you will always vote the way your constituents want. Now, a trustee is kind of the opposite. A trustee, the representative votes based on her own best judgment as to what is best for the constituents. Okay, so it doesn't matter really, for the most part, what the constituents want. The trustee was voted in because the constituents trusted her or him to make good decisions. They are entrusted with the power to vote, and the constituents back home are going to trust her to vote the proper way. And of course, if she does not vote the proper way, then they can change their legislator in the next election. They can change their representative in the next election. So the trustee basically doesn't really care what the constituents want as far as the majority of the constituents. They're going to vote based on their best judgment. Most are what we call politicos. Most representatives are called or would fall into the category of politicos. And that's a representative that acts either as a delegate or a trustee depending on the issue. And it usually boils down to how high profile or controversial the issue is. If the issue is very high profile and it's in the news, or it's very controversial, there's a big debate about it, in the newspapers or on television or whatever, then the representative will act as a delegate. Because if it's a very controversial, high profile issue, the voters are paying attention as to how their representative votes. So that if it's something people care about or talking about, they're going to watch and they're going to pay attention to how their representative votes. And so the representative wants to be seen as favorable by their constituents. So they're going to vote like the constituents. Now, if it's a minor bill, if it's something that's not controversial, something that's not super important and that people aren't really talking about, well, most representatives act as a trustee. They'll vote how they think, whatever they think is best for their constituents and the state, regardless, even if there is a majority of the constituents that disagree, they'll generally vote as a trustee and vote their own conscience. So a politico can be either a delegate or a trustee. It just depends on the issue and how high profile or controversial the issue is. And in conclusion, all information in this presentation, as well as information in the chapter, the textbook, may appear on the exams.